So about a year ago, when I started to make videos on my YouTube channel, the first video was a video about the Commodore 64 power supply that I have designed, which was actually a very simple design, and this thing is a switch mode power supply. Well, and the reason why I made this is because the original power supply has got some issues, because it can overheat, and if that happens the 5-watt regulator may go bad. And when that happens, well, it could be that more than 5 volts will enter the machine, and well, that eventually will kill your Commodore 64. Now, I have gotten a lot of requests of some people asking, well, how did you build this thing? How are the schematics for this? Well, that's why I'm revisiting my very first video, and I'm going to open the thing up once more, and I will show you exactly how this thing works. It's actually fairly simple. Now, first of all, before we are going to build our own unit, there are a couple of warnings that you might want to look out for. Well, first of all, since it's a device that you build yourself, you will have some parts that are running on the mains voltage, which in my case is 230 volts. It may be to 110 or even 240 in different regions, and yeah, so make sure that you cover all of these contacts properly up, because if you do something wrong or you come in contact with that voltage, it can kill you. So this is some serious stuff here, so really take the precautions and use more heat shrink tubing than necessary, or electrical tape. Also, some other things you might want to look out for is if the cables that go to the Commodore 64 carry the wrong voltages on the pins, you may destroy your entire machine, and that is something you don't really want. So also look out for that. And the last thing, well, you need some fuses, so that if something goes wrong, or a Commodore 64 breaks, or the power supply has a failure, those fuses will blow and will not damage your machine. So here's a small list of components you will need. You will need soldering iron and some soldering skills, of course, some solder, solder grease, hot glue, electrical tape, which is definitely necessary on the mains voltage side. It's also necessary on the other sides where you have lower voltages, but still it's the most important thing in the entire thing. Then you will need some thicker cables for the 220 volts or 120 volts line. What I did, I used an old C64 power supply that was defective, and used the correct plug depending on your region. And then of course you will need the connector that connects to the Commodore 64, which in my case I just took from the defective power supply. And of course 4 cables for that. And of course, as I mentioned, you will need the connector and everything. If you don't have that, you can easily buy them in any electronics store that sell pieces. But yeah, the easiest thing again is just use a defective power supply or an old one which you don't want to use anymore. So, what we'll need now is also a 9-volt AC wall adapter. I used a PCB transformer since these are a lot easier to find, and wall adapters are a bit hard to find in the 9-volt AC version, since almost no devices actually use that. So a PCB transformer is definitely the correct thing. Only thing here you have to look out for is that you have got all the correct voltages depending on your region, because a 9-volt AC wall adapter mostly can go from 110 to 240 volts, but the PCB transformer will only be for a specific region. For example, in mine it just says 230 volts or 220, and that's it. You cannot use that in another region, or otherwise you will not get the correct voltage on the other side. Also, you could damage it. And of course, make sure that that thing can go up to 2 amps. I'm using a current that high so that it can blow a fuse. On the original Commodore 64 power supply it says you should install a 1.6 amp fuse on that. And yeah. You will also need a 5 volt DC wall adapter. In the best case you take a switching one and make sure that this one goes to 3 amps. And again install some fuses for 1.6 amps on that. So, and now just the last of our components, which are just some fuses and the fuse holders. And for the fuses I recommend the 1.6 amp fuses, the same as mentioned on the original power supply. And I used fast blowing fuses, which, well, they would just blow out a lot faster, and the chances of the Commodore 64 breaking if something goes bad are a lot less. And, well, the most important thing for me probably, or just for verifying something, is the multimeter, so that we can just verify if every pin gives out the correct voltages before we connect the entire thing to the computer and not destroy anything. And the last thing is just a case that is big enough to fit all the components inside. Also, one thing I should recommend is do not use this thing with the case opened or disassembled. Really put it inside of a case so that there is no chance that you can get in contact with the mains voltage, which you really don't want. Here's just a last warning and something I should look out for, because the pinout I'm using in the circuit diagram right now is the pinout on the computer, not the plug. If you hook it up the wrong way, you will break your Commodore 64, so just keep in mind that this is not the pinout of the plug. I will have a pinout of a plug after I show you the circuit diagram. So here finally we have the circuit diagram. Just note up there, the simple version is only standing for a version that does not have the meters on it. Those can be installed whenever you want to, it's just hooking up an voltmeter and an ammeter. So, on the left side we have the mains voltage input. Those will go to our 2 transformers or wall adapters. We have a 9 volt AC wall adapter or a PCB transformer on the top, and a 5 volt DC wall adapter on the bottom. Now, the AC line will go on the top to pin 6 and 7, which are on the top of the plug. Please install the fuse there, or if something goes wrong, there is no protection for the machine and you could damage it. On the bottom we have the 5 volt DC wall adapter, and here you have to be careful because the pinout must be correct, otherwise you will break your machine. Again, this is not the pinout of the plug, this is the pinout on the computer, so don't wire the plug like this. So, first of all, we have the negative lead going to pin 2, which is the center bottom. And then we have the positive pin going through a fuse to pin 5, which is the plus 5 volts in pin on the computer. So actually that is just very simple. And as long as you wire everything correct, nothing should go wrong. Because this is exactly the same version I have wired my power supply, and it's still working absolutely fine. And I'm having no issues with it whatsoever. And also a good thing about it is, since I'm using a switch mode power supply, well, at least the 5 volt line, it's not generating a lot of heat, and the power supply is also using a lot less current on the mains side. And finally, to verify if you have made everything correct, this is the pinout of the plug, and if that is matching, well, then you are good to go, and you will be able to use your Commodore 64 with your new power supply. If your pinout doesn't match this, well, at least the plus 5 and the ground line, you should definitely check the connections and rewire it again, otherwise you will damage your machine, and you really don't want to do that. So, if everything is working, you plug everything in and you should be good to go to play some Commodore 64 games or use just the software from it.